everyone. Welcome to this week's In the Artist Studio. I'm Elena Gross, the curatorial manager of exhibitions at MOAD, and it's my pleasure today to be speaking and touring in virtual space with one of my favorites, Oakland-based artist, writer, and curator, Leila Weefur. Before we get to the conversation, as I mentioned earlier, I just want to get through a few housekeeping things. So audience members, as you come into the room, if you wouldn't mind dropping in the chat and telling us where you're joining us from, this helps with our analytics, and it's just nice to see. MOAD's physical building may be closed due to the mandatory shelter in place, but you can still get your fill of art and artists of the African diaspora. Each Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard, join MOAD staff members like myself as we visit some of our favorite artists in their studios to see what they're currently working on and how their work is changing as a result of quarantine. This is a rare opportunity to hear from artists directly from their studios, and we will follow all talks with an audience Q&A. So please feel free to leave your questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box at any point in time during the talk today. And please visit our website to see which artists we have coming up. You can also go back and watch all of our past talks on the MOAD YouTube channel. Today's talk is co-presented with McAvoy Foundation for the Arts, and this series was made possible by generous donations from the Westridge Foundation, our wonderful MOAD members, and viewers like you. MOAD stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, Walter Wallace Jr., and so many others who have lost their lives at the hands of police brutality and racial injustice, including those whose names we do not know. We'd also like to give a land acknowledgement. Most of us are settler immigrants or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples whose land we are located. With deep respect, MOAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, our people, our work, and our network servers on native lands, and we thank the indigenous people of the Bay Area who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Lastly, if you've been enjoying the series or any MOAD programming, please consider donating to MOAD Online. Donations of any amount are always welcome. A link to where you can donate will also be dropped in the chat. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured artist. Leila Weefur, pronouns she, they, he, is a trans-gender-nonconforming artist, writer, and curator based in Oakland, California. Through video and installation, they examine the performativity intrinsic to systems of belonging present in our lived experiences. The work brings together concepts of the sensorial memory, abject blackness, hypersurveillance, and the erotic. Weefur is a recipient of the Hung Liu Award, the Murphy and Cadogan Award, and the Walter and Elise Haas Creative Work Fund. Weefur has worked with local and national institutions, including SFMOMA, the Wattis Institute, Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and Smack Mellon in Brooklyn, New York. Their writing has been published by Sming Books and Objects, Baest Journal, Berkeley Poetry Review, and more. Weefur is a lecturer at the University of California, Berkeley, and California College of the Arts. They are a member of the curatorial film collective, The Black Aesthetic. Welcome, Leila.
Thank you, Elena. So nice to be on Zoom with you.
Always nice to be on Zoom with you. You're one of my favorite artists and one of my favorite people. So this is very exciting for me.
Slightly biased because we work together on many projects.
That is very true. One of which we will talk about very shortly.
Yes.
But yeah, it's always exciting to get to hear you talk about your work. You've done a lot of press recently, obviously, around the exhibition that you curated, which we'll also talk a little bit about later at McAvoy, New Labor Movements. And so I feel like I've gotten to hear a lot of your perspective around recent work. And so I hope that this will be really refreshing for people who are just coming to know your work, and also to give a little bit of context for that show.
Yeah, I hope so. It's been weird times, but I'm really glad that project came out of it, something that I was working really hard on during quarantine. So it was something I was able to focus on.
You began the project kind of just before things kind of shut down?
Yeah, I started in right at the beginning of March, maybe end of February, we started having meetings about it. And then, it all hit. And I'd actually come up with most of the curatorial program before any of the Black Lives Matter stuff happened, before we knew how long we were going to be in quarantine for, before we even knew what it would look like to be in any kind of art space in general. So It's kind of interesting to see it come to fruition.
has your perspective on any of the kind of curatorial framing changed from when you first, the first iteration of it to where it is now seeing it in person? You've obviously gone through the show yourself a few times now.
I mean, definitely, because the questions that people have around it are different and specifically tailored to what has happened since I, curated it. So I'm getting a lot of election questions, a lot of obviously Black Lives Matter centered questions. And, the whole program was curated around the idea of movements, and that's movements of all kinds: philosophical, political, cinematic. So, the political movements that I was thinking about while crafting the program kind of unfolded in front of us over time.
It's kind of exciting to see it, to see it be this very responsive, kind of this responsive project in a way that we all hope that our projects will take on a new life, a new form as time goes on, but to really see it in real time is pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I don't want to get too much into that just yet. I want to start out first by, I like to ground the audience a little bit in the space that we're in to make it feel more like a studio visit. So I don't know if you want to show us around. I don't know if you have anything to show off in your studio, but if you could talk a little bit about where you are right now and what your studio practice is kind of looks like now, now that we're all in quarantine or shelter in place or what have you.
Yeah, so I'm in Oakland, California, for those of you who don't know. And I was born and raised in Oakland, California. I didn't always live here, but I came back here and I've been here for a while now. So my studio is in like West Oakland, for those of you who are familiar with Oakland. And I am in a studio building called Magnolia, or it's on Magnolia, right next to Magnolia Projects. And I'm a video artist, so I don't always have things on the wall. I know that is somewhat disappointing for people who are like, ooh, we're in the artist studio, we get to see materials, but.
Well, it looks like you have something on the wall behind you.
I do. So as a part of a lot of my projects, I oftentimes publish books or some kind of ephemera. And so I like to have them on display for if I were to ever have an in-person studio visit again, or if I need to revisit a work or a particular aesthetic that was top of mind when I was making a project. So that is, those are always on display. And also books that I haven't necessarily created myself, but have been a part of, like Color Theory is up there, which is a wonderful book published by Wolfman. A lot of my Black aesthetic books are there. So, there are things to remind myself what to be proud of, and if people want to see, like, I have a tiny screening room that I built just during quarantine because I wanted to have a place to watch movies and show my work, and I have a little couch. It's a pretty spare studio, but that's kind of how I like it. I need a clean, empty space in order to build new ideas.
Would you say, we talked a little bit, obviously, just now about how new labor movements kind of came to be, but would you say that your production has slowed down or sped up at all? Has the rate of work that you've done changed in this period of time?
Definitely. I think that I was probably ready to do a new project this year. But with with quarantine, I had to put a lot of projects on hold. For one, Between Beauty and Horror was supposed to be showing in the Midwest, and I was going to be doing a re-envisioning of that work with two artists in conversation with it, Kevin McCoy and Cameron Granger. So that's something that I've been working with in partnership with Acre, which is a residency out in Chicago. And they also have an art space. And so what I do a lot of the time is partner with institutions to really create immersive installations. And it's less about my work being shown. Oftentimes it's more about the partnership and me building relationships with people. That is also part of my practice. So I've been doing a lot of that kind of work, like just planning for the next thing to happen, because so many things got put off.
Right.
Yeah.
And so many things are still kind of unknown. So
many things are unknown. And because I make installation work, it requires people to be physically present in the space. I said I didn't want to do any projects this year or any of my own shows because it's sad to me that people can't gather in a space safely right now. So.
And we'll talk a little bit more too about how you envision space in the work that you do. But to give those who may not be super familiar with your film work, your video work, your practice, a little bit of a primer, I'm going to show a brief clip of the first video work or the first video installation of yours that I had seen at Kala a few years ago, Blackberry Pastorale Symphony No. 1. So.
Okay.
I'm just gonna pull it from your website.
Great.
Start again. Okay, so that was a very brief, very small clip of a much longer project. One of the things that I really appreciated about the first time I saw that particular work was the fact that you kind of walked me through that show and were very insistent upon, which is a thing that you love to do, of setting the person down in front of the work and then disappearing and then popping back at the very end and asking, so what did you think? And it was just really nice to kind of, the experience of it is something that I think you care a whole lot about. And so I think one of the things that it makes me curious about is just sort of what were your earliest and fondest film memories? And what are some of your earliest and fondest like film inspirations?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've talked about this personally, but one of the first films that I would say was really kind of pivotal for me, at least in the ways that I saw film and cinema, was Eve's Bayou by Casey Lemons. And I mean, that's for so many reasons. And I didn't even, at the time when I was a kid and I saw it, I didn't even know that it was a Black woman who directed it. But obviously, as I grew up and I learned that, it made the work more powerful. But I think something about Eve's Bayou that was remarkable to me was how well structured the narrative was. And I think that was the first time that I had really spent a lot of time in like Black magical realism. And there's a lot of like Southern, voodoo, a lot of the New Orleans, like sensorial parts of Blackness that I had never been exposed to prior, because my mom, who's here watching, was constantly watching dramas and Westerns. And, she would tell you herself that she loves the good, the bad, and the ugly, and True Grit. Like, she was watching Westerns all the time, to the point where there would be some Saturday mornings where she would be so excited by a scene that she would call me in the bedroom and be like, look at this scene, look at this scene, look at this scene. And I'm like, I don't really care about this scene. But later on, I guess I kind of sort of integrated that behavior into the ways that I ask people to watch things. I also really obviously love like Belly. That was incredible for me to see early on, especially like the first 5 minutes. The opening scene of Belly is remarkable. And I even show my students parts of that film now because I think it was amazing to see Hype Williams, who was then a music video director, make his first feature film with all these rappers in it. And I think as a child, I was really attracted to a lot of the like gangster films of the 90s because it was so far from my reality. And I really wanted to understand this part of Black culture that I didn't necessarily feel a part of. And I think fondest film memories, definitely when I discovered like food in cinema, you know, when I really learned that food could be a narrative tool. And, you know, some of those films were like Tampopo. There's a famous egg scene in Tampopo where there is a male character and a female character. It's a Japanese film where they're like, you know, passing an egg yolk back and forth between their mouths. And it was really erotic and sensual and very gross at the same time, but I was so attracted to it. Similarly with Ganja and Hess, there's a scene where the cherry is split open and the woman, they're at a dinner table or some table eating, and the woman like takes her index finger and like takes the juice from the cherry and like just like sucks on her finger. And I, you know, similarly, I was really attracted to that moment. And so every time I saw that repeating itself in different films that I was attracted to, I was like, well, this means something. Obviously, another one is Color of Pomegranates. I think food, we can talk more about food, but I think food was my entry point to the sensorial experience. It's one of the things that for me makes sensorial memory more accessible. And having a sensorial understanding of something allows me and the people watching, I think, to embody it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously food, something I've noticed in some of the works that I'm not going to be able to share just because we don't have time. There's another video where there's like an apple or another fruit, it looks like, that's kind of being split apart in a video. It seems like not even specifically food, but also fruit is an item, is a choice that comes up quite a lot in the work that you do. Is there a reason why fruit more than other foods plays such a significant role?
I mean, I think that's just the fruit that's just the kind of food that I found
Most pleasurable, most
not necessarily most pleasurable, but food is it's so loaded in many ways. I think I was in grad school and you know, at Mills, I wasn't encouraged to use people in my work. They didn't like that kind of representational work. So I was like, well, whatever, I'm going to find a different way to introduce a body into my work. And so fruit seemed to be the easiest way. And I think someone called, like in a critique once, someone said that my work was low hanging fruit. And so I was like, okay, whatever, I'm going to actually use fruit then, you know, because of the strange fruit reference obviously. And so then I found myself really attracted to it. The fleshiness of it, the ways that it breaks apart, tears apart, disintegrates in your hands, it bleeds like human bodies do. So it's a good option, I think.
So one of the other questions, so I've noticed with Blackberry Pastorale, one of the things that accompanied the video were these prints, these intaglio prints that you made. It seems that in many of the projects that you do, you work across a few mediums outside of just the camera. So there's printmaking, there's installation, there's books, obviously. And it feels like the externalization of the video work is important to you. And I was just wondering if you could kind of talk about how you conceive of each component of a project and why each component on its own feels necessary.
Well, the thing that started me on the like path of printmaking and bookmaking was this question around language and how language can physically impact a body. And I was asking myself quite frequently if language and our participation in it could be manifested physically on our exteriors, what would that look like? And so I did a lot of experimenting with paper, because I thought paper could actually receive an impact through forms of letterpress, and intaglio could receive impact, and that would actually leave an impression on a body. And that was the most literal translation of that. And then, you know, what does it look like when saying a word becomes harmful to a body, but also holds space for the erotic and the grotesque? And so that, you know, kind of led me down the path that took me to the blackberry prints, where I, you know, used blackberries for the ink. And then, you know, with every project I publish a book, and that, I mean, I think that that's a more simple answer, in that it allows the work to travel outside of the space. Because something that's really sad about installation work is that once it comes down, you can't experience it again. So what can give audiences that experience without actually having to physically be present is a book. And that's been my easiest answer so far.
It feels kind of great that it allows you, having a book or having these objects allows you to hold something that cannot be held. You know, the space of the screen and video is not something that we can tangibly ever hold, really. And so this allows audiences to do that. I don't know, that's not something I thought about previously about your work, but it's something, as you were talking about it just now, felt resonant.
Yeah, totally. I think it's amazing when the work can travel outside of the city that it's being shown in. And so many people now have access to the work because of the ways all of these different objects have traveled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to be able to show another clip from another video project of yours from 2018 called Noise and Thirst. So
silencing of like a part of my characters that, like, as a childhood, a part of my childhood got silenced.
If white is all frequencies at once.
If white is all frequencies at once.
Black is the color
Black
of
is
silence.
the color of silence. Black is the color of silence.
Black is the color of silence.
I always knew I was black. I knew it in my bones.
I have a story about this, actually. The evening air was heavy with the promise of rain. Christian and I are walking down Franklin, my hand stuffed in my pockets to keep warm, his hand in one pocket and the other, inserting and removing a cigarette from his lips. He told me he'd kill himself if he was a white person. The concept of him being anything other than a black man is too much to bear. Thought about it myself. I'd probably do myself in too. I'd probably do myself in too. I'd probably do myself in too.
I felt my blackness as a verbal bitch slap at the age of 12, when running towards a glittering arcade. Prior to the experience, my blackness was an inconsequential expanse that I walked towards with childish stupidity.
Black is the color of silence.
All these white kids, and there's like one Asian, like everybody was laughing about like they're cracking black jokes and shit, and I realized in that moment I'm the only black person here, and like it was like a kind of like a, have you ever seen a movie where it's like somebody sitting at a table and the whole like table like zooms outward and you're just like you know, it was, I don't know how to explain it, but I remember like that moment was like, oh shit, like they're talking to me. Oh shit, like they're talking to me.
Any sense of imagination or innocence is taken away from you, or
It just doesn't exist for you because of what you're born into. I'm just walking, looking at everything, and somebody's yelling nigger from a window, and I can't find them. And they just keep yelling it up until the point where I leave, and I'm like, damn, is it really like that?
Desperation. Grasp for normalcy.
These idiots are loud, uneducated.
That lady just wanted to be left alone. She didn't want to give me no water. But I was thirsty that day. And it was cold outside. And I didn't do her no harm.
And a cop followed me 3 cities over until I was the Oakland Police Department's problem. My fatalistic tango with the state.
It's just for
They well with a mixture.
somehow attract these girls people, like flies to a carcass.
Can't really say I feel like a black man in this body. I've looked at myself in the mirror and found an uncertain creature staring back. Not completely into the idea of being a doughy-bodied, American-born African man.
I always knew I was black. I knew it in my bones.
Can't really say I feel like a black man in this body. I've looked at myself in the mirror and found an uncertain creature staring back.
Because faggots can't be men.
Not completely into the
And I
idea
thank
of
God
being a
I'm gonna be
doughy-bodied, American-born African male.
Because faggots can't be men. And I thank God I'm the people.
Because faggots can't be men. And I thank God honor the be one.
Because women can't be faggots.
If white is all frequencies one.
Okay, and we're gonna pause it there just because I want to make sure we have time to get through everything. But yeah, so in this particular work, the audio is composed of many anonymous seeming disembodied voices, all speaking to different experiences with Black masculinities and malehood. How many respondents did you use for this piece, and how did you navigate stitching together all of their different stories as well as your own?
I use a lot. I don't even know if I have a number, because that piece is an extremely reactive piece for me. I typically don't make work that is in that kind of reactionary space, but I think you know this story, but I was at a convenience store and was called the cops on and was described to the police as a Black man. And so there was this moment where I realized that I was seen in the world. My body was identified as male, as masculine. And so I was just in the space of wanting to collect as many stories, memories, recollections from other Black masculine folks in the community. And so, I didn't have a way to quantify it because it was really just like coming off of a desire to learn more about Black masculinity. And the sound composition was kind of the manifestation of me processing that experience. It's called Noise and Thirst for many reasons. When I think of noise, I consider like many things, right? I consider it to be something that isn't music, that's not associated with a pleasant sound. I think of like an interference or some kind of unwanted signal or aggregation of signals. When I also think of noise, I think of an old television, like TV static, noise, a container for contrast. I also think of like the presence and absence of like a bunch of tiny fragments on a TV screen. And I think in many ways, I saw the sound composition as this like sensorial experience of that as well. Like, how Blackness materializes in our minds, how it can also represent noise, something that is seen as unwanted, in fragment and in contrast to something. So it was through noise that complicated sensibility of Black masculinity unfolded for me.
But we obviously, through the title, we also have to deal with this idea of thirst, which to me, the first thing that I would associate in terms of thirst is is this idea of desire, of this idea of wanting desperately for something. And so one of the questions that I have for you is, we've talked about this a lot, but it seems like this question of belonging comes up in this work and in many of the other works that we'll present. There's a way in which they all these videos seem to speak specifically to a Black audience, but also as if the videos themselves are ambivalently aware of both being an insider and outsider at the same time within that space. And you and I have talked about it personally as feeling indicative of a sort of Black queer experience of being queer within a Black space. And thinking about, that desire for belonging and that desire for, while also being already kind of inside. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that in this video and also to just like your work at large.
I mean, I obviously wanted to situate myself in Black masculinity because I had spent my entire life not identifying as a male, right? And I pretty consistently have lived in a constant state of assessment of my performance of Blackness and queerness, sort of later in life. But in many ways, I'm inseparable from my work. And, part of that is really leaning into that assessment and trying to understand the mechanics of performance that occurs across, all planes of existence. We've talked about performance existing in private and public, and obviously many layers to that as well. But I think specifically with insider-outsider dynamics, I think that understanding Blackness and the imagined space that Blackness can provide and claims to provide, an insider can somewhat easily become an outsider as an outsider through some kind of active engagement and consumption of the culture can become an insider.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the things that are very present for me in a lot of the work. I don't know if that answered the question. It was kind of a long
It does. No, it does. It opened, I feel like it provides a lot of additional questions as well, but
yeah,
we only have an hour, so we'll just have to keep going.
Yeah.
So I want to be able to show another clip from the more recent video work and continuously evolving projects between beauty and horror, which I had the pleasure of being able to collaborate with you on in the form of the book that was created, and as well as the performance. Oh, there it is.
Your name right there?
That's my name. So I'm going to show a brief clip from that piece as well to give people a little bit of a primer of it for it.
We were all standing in a circle. About 5 of us. More like a round blob where we gathered in the spirit of wasting time. What we do. Did. Did. Gathered around an ideology of Blackness. That, for most, was unattainable. The metrics were decided by no one, but expected of everyone. Stood in that circle. Lines were resistant and black. I wonder if, for them, lines were also invisible. I don't remember exactly who was there. In my foggy memory of that moment, I'm pretty sure were present. They were the usual participants. But I do remember is how loud we were laughing. We laugh that black vibratory laugh that erases the chalk from hopscotch gritted ground. We laugh so loud our mouths were noiseless. The frequency of our inanity was the color of silence. Black. What I don't remember is the texture of the container that held them in space. They were floating. Maybe the room had been erased by all the laughter, because all I can remember is the darkness. All I can remember with certainty is the 5 of them sitting in a circle on wooden chairs, like school desks. All I can remember is how quickly their guns were drawn. They all held one. Then one of their guns goes off for real this time. And I remember because it was louder than the others. Then I realized there were only 4 and one had been hit. What I do remember is how beautifully still the body lay, drawing a perfect line, becoming part of the ecology.
Oh, it's showing video over Zoom is so upsetting.
I know, but I'm glad that people are going to get a chance to see some part of this work since, obviously the in-person installation won't be able to happen again for quite some time. So that particular clip, that sequence that we just saw was a dream sequence, which similar to what we were just discussing with Noise and Thirst, which came out of an experience. Well, some of the impetus for was a personal experience that you had. This was a dream sequence. This was a dream that you had that then turned into a written piece that then became this particular part of the film. And so it seems like a lot of these works begin from this very deeply personal place, this very autobiographical place, and yet you never use yourself in any of or at least in the pieces that we're seeing now. There's always a proxy, either via actors or via blackberry fruits. And so I was just wondering, I guess, that seems like an intentional choice. And so what the reasoning behind that is, and whether or not that's something using your own likeness in later performative work is something you're interested in exploring.
Not at all.
Oh
What'd you say?
And then I like that answer. It's honest.
Yeah, I don't feel a need to put my physical self in any of the work. And there's some of my voice in Noise and Thirst, but it's so buried that I wouldn't want anyone to hear it and recognize it as my voice. You'd have to really know my voice to know. But part of like writing stories and writing for cinema is figuring out how to translate a vision or a dream or a thought that you have, a concept, and stretch it out over time. And I think that there are many people out in the world who I can use performance-wise that can do it much better than I would be able to. And I think it's about recognizing like other people's performative abilities. And I like pretty frequently don't use trained actors. I use people on the street because I can identify in someone when their movements, their body movements, their language, their expressions are performing in a way that I want to make come alive in front of a camera. And so I like to lean into like improvisation and, try to exercise my directorial voice through other people and through their bodies. It's like manipulating bodies across the board.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next question, which is that you famously have said in different interviews that you've had, especially recently, that you build your work with an interest in the discomfort of your audience, and that you want your audiences to feel discomfort and to sit with that. What are the material ways in which you build discomfort into the viewing experiences of your work? And is it through the architecture of the space, sound, audience participation, and why is that important to you?
Well, yeah, I do. I really like discomfort because so much growth happens in the space of discomfort, right? And as I learned about film, what I grew to understand is how much power a filmmaker can have over an audience. And I think, I'm biased in saying this, but more than any other art form, it has the power to manipulate. And that's because it pulls on so many of the sensorial strings, right? You have obviously the visual and the auditory with the sight and sound, but like I was saying earlier with food, you have the tactile touch, you have the gustatory sense, you can speak to the sense of taste. So I've been drawn to directors and cinematographers who understand the mechanics of control and use it to their like narrative advantage in many ways, like Hitchcock or Krzysztof Kieslowski, even Spike Lee. They have a deep early Spike Lee. Let me say early Spike Lee. They have a deep understanding of how to use like light and space and materials. And I think to understand film is to understand the senses. And so with a lot of like the architectural component of my work, I want to simulate like systems of interaction that bind people to one another, like covertly, non-consensually sometimes. It's about constructing physical environments for an audience to have like a multi-sensory engagement and invite them into the possibility of understanding the Black experience through the ways that their body is experiencing something. So if you feel aroused, or if you feel hungry, or if you feel, any kind of feeling you have is a step closer to understanding and being closer to the nucleus of a narrative, of my story even.
It'll be interesting to see how those constructions and those installations change now, given, just the world that we've been in for the last 8 months, and that we're going to continue to find ourselves. The next time you are able to create a physical installation, how will that experience change both you as the maker and the constructor and, your collaborators, and also how it will change the way audiences kind of approach the work? That'll be very, you could probably write a book just on that.
Oh God, don't give me more work to do.
I mean, not you, I mean, the collective you,
Yeah, the collective you, for sure.
Right, exactly, not you specifically. I mean, there you could,
I mean, something that architecture does, and I'm really trying to understand how I can improve on my understanding of architecture and those kinds of materials, but architectural video installations like pose these dilemmas that force the viewer to confront their own placement in physical space. And that's something that I really like to, lean into. I want to control the mobility of an audience so that they can somehow through that mobility understand their participation in like racialized dynamics, particularly with the racialized dynamics of Blackness.
Well, I'm keenly aware that we're getting close to the Q&A portion. I want to be able to leave space for people to ask questions because there are already a few in the Q&A box. But I want to first address I want to give a little bit of space to the exhibition that's currently on view at McAvoy right now, New Labor Movements, and talk a little bit about that. So I have just two kind of initial questions around New Labor Movements. The first is just sort of what was the experience like of curating works and creating an experience directly in response to another artist's work, especially an artist like Isaac Julian. You know, I think someone as one just as lauded as Isaac in general, but then also thinking about, and I think we've talked about this, thinking about him as a figure who, you know, you've studied, you know, we may have studied early on in our academic and professional careers, to then be kind of reacting and responding directly to his work. What was that experience like for you?
Oh, I mean, well, I was asked to respond to not even like the physical installation. I was shown his 10-channel video installation on a computer screen. So I had to first imagine myself immersed in all of these screens and in this narrative. And I think it was a really remarkable experience, honestly. Never in my, I don't know, I don't want to say never in my life, but I didn't think that at this moment in my life, I would be responding to Isaac Julian's work and, you know, producing a program in conversation with it. And so I really wanted to make sure that I spoke to as many of the components of his work as possible, which is why I came up with the concept of new labor movements and like the idea of movement as the like guiding principle, because movement can encompass so many different things, cinematically, philosophically, temporally, and you know, something that his installation does, for those of you who hopefully get to see it, it's up until March. It's kind of like a historical map, and it's unfolded. He unfolds this historical map across 10 screens, and he gives us an opportunity to approach history from different vantage points. And so with the program, I wanted to just find a collection of filmmakers and artists who could collectively do the same thing and give different perspectives of Blackness, specifically transnational Blackness that's not just rooted in the American story, because Isaac is not American. I'm only partially American. You know, there's a lot of my personal history that obviously, because I'm Liberian, extends past America. So I wanted to be able to incorporate that part of the Black experience as well.
I really enjoyed what you said in terms about thinking about his practice as a whole and responding to it in new labor movements, finding ways to respond to all of those things in the collection of works that you chose to show. I think that brings me to my last question before I turn it over. But in Lessons of the Hour, there's this line that I believe Douglas says, that I'm going to very loosely paraphrase, that's something along the lines of, like, pictures, like songs, should be let to make their own way in the world. Which one, just I think is a fantastic line, and it's absolutely true. But it feels like a very specific through line in both your work and Isaac's work in terms of the use of song, which I hadn't thought about until seeing both the 10 screen presentation and then your presentation alongside one another, is how much song, not even just sound, but song specifically, shows up in this film work that you do. And I was just wondering, I guess, if you could talk a little bit about why, whether or not you think of song as characters or as a very important kind of character in the narratives that you create, and when that began, perhaps, when you start to think of music specifically as being so integral to the work that you do.
Oh my God, I don't know that I can answer that in a short answer, but music is incredibly important. I discovered that I wanted to be a filmmaker because I was watching music videos. So music as a narrative tool is extremely important. And obviously, like I was speaking to earlier, a lot of the sensorial experiences of film come from sound. And the voice can become a character. And I think between beauty and horror, I use the voice as a character a lot of the time. And for those of you who haven't seen it, the main character is singing a lot of songs that are very close to me. Like, for example, Drew Hill's song, Beauty. I do a kind of a interpretation of that song for the film. But the voice, I mean, it really can carry you through your emotions in many ways. And I think that's something that Isaac was doing too with Frederick Douglass and him being an orator and knowing how to use language and poetry and the voice to move people. I mean, that's the simplest, shortest answer I can give right now. I do want to like answer some folks' questions.
Yeah, we're gonna right now. That's where we're gonna turn it over to audience Q&A. So the first question from Anonymous is, please tell us more about your use of the BlackBerry.
So my answer to that is one of my favorite answers. I think most people have heard of the phrase, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. Actually, I won't say most people, because oftentimes I'm in rooms and there are people who don't raise their hands when I ask them if they've heard of that phrase, but it's a common pop culture phrase. And I think while I was making the work, that phrase was sticking with me, that colloquial phrase. And what really kind of caught me up was how I'd been using it my entire life. And I'd been hearing it, but I never really stopped to think about what, like, the implications of that phrase, and who exactly was implied in that phrase. And the more research I did, the more that I discovered, like, for example, the first time it appeared on paper was in 1924. And it was Wallace Thurman's book called The Blacker the Berry. And so that was kind of like my entry point to understanding performativity, because I learned and grappled with the fact that colloquialisms are always dependent on a sort of performativity. And the BlackBerry for me is like a proxy for the Black femme body. At least it was at the time of, the work BlackBerry Pastoral. And I kind of took the BlackBerry on as an image study because, as with the phrase, I didn't feel closely related to the BlackBerry as like a Black feminine body. When I heard the phrase, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice, I never thought that someone was talking about me or referring to me. I never saw myself reflected in that phrase. And so that's why I use the BlackBerry, because it represents this body that is not mine. But people make an assumption of Black femininity that I am supposed to embody that I have never been able to. So the BlackBerry is an extremely important icon for me, or symbol.
Okay, so a next question comes from Facebook. Who is the intended audience for your work? Do you consider the responses and readings and how they might differ between Black and Indigenous POC and white audience members?
I don't ever make the work thinking that I want a specific person or group of people to see it. I think I leave it open in such a way that for Black folks, if they recognize things that are obviously coded for them to understand, they will have a different interpretation of the work. For white audiences who are hearing things for the first time, like, there are many people who didn't know that was from a Dru Hill song and don't even know who Dru Hill is. I know my mom is somewhere laughing, but it's introducing them to something new, they're being exposed to a part of Black culture through the work. So, I don't think that it's for anyone or not for anyone. It's for everyone who are willing to place their bodies in that space and are open to it.
That was a good little soundbite. You should save that for later. The next question comes from someone who I believe is related to you, Terry Weefur. You talked about needing a clear studio space to work. Can you talk a bit about more of your creative process and muses?
Wow, yeah, I definitely do need a clear space to work. My creative process, usually it starts with writing, and not even like writing a script. It starts with me writing some kind of poetic, experimental prose sort of essay that usually turns into what I publish in the book. But that kind of informs the more structural components. So the words give, for whatever reason, inform structure and architecture, because language is very structural and architectural, even if you think about the letter forms. But from that point, the structural component informs the video practice. And so then it kind of unfolds that way. And not always, I think it can be a bit scrambled, but usually, and right now I'm in a sort of collective or collecting phase of the project where I'm just like collecting objects and doing a bunch of research and reading for the next thing that I'm working on. So yeah, my process is quite scrambled and probably only I can understand it. I wish I had a clearer process sometimes.
All right, the next question is, you had a piece at SFMOMA during the reckoning they had to deal with. How was that experience, and did you find you were able to make change for that organization as an artist?
Well, you were also involved in that.
I know. So that's why I saved that question for last, because I was thinking about it in my own head.
For an organization as two people who were working with it, I don't think so. No. It takes a lot more than just a single artist to change an institution. I think, what I did, what me and Elena in Heavy Breathing did was use the tiny bit of power that we had to become visible and make our version of the story visible on their social media and on our social media, so that we could then we could then expose what was happening within the institution at large. But I don't know that we've made any significant long-term changes alone. So many people were a part of that. And so many people are doing work and are still doing work to change the institution. So I can't take any credit for that, nor do I want to take any credit for that. I mean, we have friends that work at SFMOMA who are doing a lot of internal work. So power to them.
Yes. So wait, what?
Do you have an answer to that?
I have not one. We've got no time left. Not one that I could give at this current moment in time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do want to. We're at time, but I just want to share some of the not so much questions, but the nice comments that we've received on Facebook. Ashara Akandayo says she's so excited about the brilliant work and collaboration Leila is stewarding as curator and artist and archivist. Thank you, Moad, for hosting this conversation today. And also another comment from Facebook is, yes, the Pan-African, African diasporic identity and movement making and artwork is a common through line. So I want to make sure people on Facebook feel seen. Thank you for watching today. And thank you for being in conversation with me today, Leila. Before we close out, is there anything you want to plug real quick? I like to give artists an opportunity to shout out their upcoming projects.
Just go into new labor movements if you're in the Bay Area, and there will be a series of conversations that happen. And for one, Isaac Julian and Angela Davis will be in conversation tonight. I'm not a part of that, but God, how could you miss that? And then I have other programs in the spring, because new labor movements will switch in the second half of new labor movements will open in January. So if you come to the Bay Area and visit the show, that's the only plug I have. Also, thank you, Elena, for being such a good friend and collaborator. I want to gush over you.
You can. We have time for that. We don't.
Shout out to Ashara and my cousin and my mom for coming, and anyone else who I know and love who are present. Thank you for being here.
Well, it was an honor and a pleasure to be able to host this talk today, and obviously, I'll text you later. I'm certain I'll see you around, basically.
I'll see you.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. If you have friends who didn't have a chance to catch the talk today, this talk will be posted onto the MOAD YouTube channel later, most likely today or tomorrow. So look out for that and be sure to tell people to tune in every week at 1 p.m. for In the Artist Studio.